My name is Karen Houseconnect. I'm the Associate Provost for Research. I want to invite you to, or welcome you to our seminar today. This event is also live streamed, so I want to welcome everyone who is joining us remotely. I'm really delighted to introduce our speaker today. It's a very fascinating topic, and I'm glad you were all able to join us. Dr. Carol Nemeroff received her BA degree from McGill University and her Ph.D. in clinical psychology from the University of Pennsylvania. Currently, she is professor of social and behavioral sciences at the University of Southern Maine, and she is also a principal at MeRTEC, which stands for Maine Regulatory Training and Ethics Center at USM. And today she's going to talk to us about ethics and stress, which I think applies to all of us. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Nemeroff.
All right, so my first question is, can everybody hear me? It seems like the microphone is working. I'm short, and this is a podium for tall people, so I'm going to move back and forth. But I think with the configuration, you guys won't be able to see me at all times, so I'll move and hope that that works. So I've been working with colleagues, let's see if this, yes, Bruce Thompson and Ross Hickey at University of Southern Maine for the past 3 years, I guess it is, at MeRTEC. We made up the name. It's actually a pun. We were started in response to community needs. People approached us from the community saying, we need help for entrepreneurship. There are Byzantine regulations. This is stifling our creativity and ability to do things like international trade, and we need help, and what can you do to help us? And so we got Maine Economic Improvement Fund funding and made up a center. MeRTEC is also a pun because Mer stands for ocean, and initially this was supposed to support the ocean cluster, the development of an ocean cluster in Portland, Maine, modeled along the ocean cluster that is out of Reykjavik, Iceland. And some of the initial work was to be joining forces for entrepreneurial purposes between Portland and Iceland. So the name has stuck, and the ocean cluster is taking a long time, but in the meantime, we've had a lot of other business from people needing help navigating regulations. Our goal was to create a cohort or two or three or an infinite number of regulatory navigators, people who would be able to understand how to orient themselves in regulatory matters, but not lawyers, because most of these initial phases don't require lawyers, and many startups can't yet afford them. So understanding the boundary between being a regulatory navigator, a little bit savvy about regulation, versus where you call in a lawyer was an important delineation. We are also working with the law school at the University of Maine to coordinate so that we can form pathways from the undergraduate to the graduate curriculum. Our key focus is not just regulation, though. You'll notice that the word ethics is in the title, and a lot of people, when we talk about regulation and then move to talking about ethics, say, huh? They literally ask, what does regulation have to do with ethics? And the answer is that regulation should, in most cases, have come out of some history where something ends up needing protection from something else. That's a tremendously oversimplified statement. But the idea behind regulations is not to make people's lives miserable. The idea behind regulations is to make things work, and to make them work for people, for entities. We have a problem globally, I would argue, which has been referred to as regulatory capture, where the very entities that are supposed to be protected from capture the regulatory process and take it over, but that's not where we're going with this talk today. The idea is that if we train people to understand not only what the rules and regulations are, but how they come out of societal needs, how they relate to ethical principles, what the function of the regulations is supposed to be, then we also will have created cohorts of people who understand when they're not working as intended and how to go about fixing them, ideally, in the ideal world. So regulation and ethics, what is being protected from whom or what. Our mission is threefold at MeRTEC. It's training, and there are some modules, I think that's on the next slide actually. Yep, through the Cutler Institute in Muskie School, there are some specific regulatory training online modules being created. That's not my job. That's not what I do at MeRTEC. I focused very heavily on curriculum development for students and professionals. So the focus on content is the online modules. The focus on the process of thinking about rules and regulations, thinking about the ethical decision-making process, and then designing curriculum to teach people that at a deep level. That's one of my two major functions there. So we've so far created, through my program, Social and Behavioral Sciences, a regulatory ethics minor and a regulatory ethics certificate program. And we've also created workshops for professionals. We delivered them at the Research Integrity Symposium for a couple of years. And one course that I just want to make sure, forgive me for pushing this, but if there are students in the audience, we're running our second experiential ethics lab in Iceland study abroad course, a short-term course for, I think we're going to be 8 days in Iceland at the end of August. It's focused on sustainability, and the culminating event there, and this is part of our design model, as you'll see as I talk a little more, is that Reykjavik University students and USM students get together for a full-day workshop. We split them into cross-cultural teams, and we have them walk through case studies that we've created to pull specifically for ethical differences that are culturally based. So last time we ran that, it went exceptionally well. This time, the Reykjavik University students will also be getting course credit for it. I'm very excited. And we had 2 students from University of Maine Farmington last time we ran it, and we'd love to have some UNE students, so catch me after if you're interested. Okay, enough of that. The third function of MeRTEC is research, how to design, evaluate, and implement innovative ethics education. And the goal here is to provide people with really strong ethical reasoning and self-regulation skills. And why do I put those together? Because ethics is complicated. Ethics tends to get very emotional. Ethical dilemmas unfold, and the resolutions of them have to unfold, usually under time pressure, conditions of uncertainty, multiple considerations, complicated incentive structures sometimes. That's going to be the bulk of the talk today. And what we want to do is figure out a model that will build resilience in people in the face of things like the social norms, the incentive structures, and all of those conditions, so that people can identify when an ethical dilemma is unfolding and slow themselves down and bring to bear all of our higher reasoning abilities rather than reacting as the human tendency is to these ethical scenarios. So there's a research agenda focused on designing, implementing, evaluating, and refining that. Okay. So the problem, why am I interested in training ethics? Why are we having this talk today? Why did you come to it? Thank you for coming. Is that there's abundant evidence out there, empirical evidence from research, that simply knowing what the regulations are, simply knowing that there are threats of sanctions if you don't follow them, that doesn't stop ethical misconduct. People engage in ethical violations anyway. They engage in them all the time. They engage in them across multiple domains. There's a lot of unethical behavior out there. There are a lot of rule violations, legal violations. So we're focused because we're getting funding also from the Federal Office of Research Integrity. So we've been focused largely, but not entirely, on research integrity as the core content from which we branch out. So within that domain, there's lots of evidence of data fabrication, plagiarism, conflict of interest, lots of human subjects violations. Some of the self-report data are really alarming. So 1 in 100 researchers actually consistently report, anonymous surveys obviously, that they knew that they had errors in their data collection, in their management of data. They report those data anyway, errors and all. That's a problem. And almost 2% self-report that they have, modified, fabricated, or falsified data. It's 2% of researchers self-reporting. Yes, it's anonymous, but this is still self-report, so it's almost certainly an underestimate. 33.7% of respondents to, this is multiple surveys, summarized in Finelli, 33.7% say that they have themselves engaged in questionable research practices. And questionable covers a lot of ground, which is one of the issues here. There is complexity involved in understanding regulations. But self-report, 72% of respondents to these surveys report that they have observed questionable research practices among their colleagues. So, of course, you could have more than one observer for a given event, so it doesn't necessarily mean that 72% of people are engaging in research misconduct, but this is only one small domain. I should just carry this with me, shouldn't I? That's brilliant. Okay, so both the problems appear to be on the rise and enforcement appears to be on the rise at the federal level. a survey by Resnick and colleagues in 2015. Resnick is one of the bigger names in this field. Surveyed 183 research programs in the United States, public and private, found that 59% of them actually had institutional policies that violated research regulations, federal regulations. That's at the policy level. That's 2015, so let's assume they collected their data in 2014, not very long ago. And enforcement is on the rise. Just to take one example from one small subfield, between 1997 and 2004, so that's a 7-year spread, the FDA issued a total of 52 warning letters. In contrast, between 2011 and 2012, 1-year spread, the FDA issued 84 warning letters. That's just the first step in the sanctions. So the events seem to be on the rise. The enforcement is certainly on the rise. People are taking it more seriously. Okay, so we also see this if you look at the literature on college students, undergraduate and graduates. So Marshall in 2000 did a survey of introductory biology and zoology students. Between 84 and 91% of them said they had, what was the language? Often or almost always manipulated lab data. And manipulation, there's a definition of this. So it isn't just that you've done something statistically to it that you're supposed to do. Manipulated it in a problematic way. As undergraduate students, they might not always be completely accurate in what's judged to be problematic versus not problematic. There is a socialization and a complexity in understanding this, but still that's alarming. McCabe and colleagues found that in business graduates, and these are graduate students from MBA programs, half of them reported cheating at some point during their graduate level career. Half of them, right? It doesn't say they cheated a lot or repeatedly, but at least once. And the major motivation in both cases was there's lots of pressure, there's lots of competition for high grades, and the pressure is what motivates the cheating. So this is particularly concerning because people don't, if you've cheated as a student, you are much more likely, it's predictive of cheating once you're out in the working world. And you can interrupt me for questions or comments or expressions of dismay or, yeah. Or I can just watch your faces, that's fine too. Yes?
You say it was the labs that they manipulated data. Was that?
Sorry, I forgot. So when they say they manipulated data in a lab, is that like a research lab or is that in a lab for a course or?
I think that was in the student lab. Oh, it's intro students. So it's their lab data in their introductory courses. Yeah, yeah. So this was the academic violations that are precursors eventually to violations in a lab. Yeah. And again, there was a better definition of manipulated in the actual survey. Yeah. Other? Yeah. So these are probably underestimates. They're self-reported data. Yes, they're generally anonymous because nobody will answer if it's not anonymous, but they're still probably conservative estimates of what's going on. And it's been suggested by a number of authors, one example is Basirico and colleagues, that this might reflect broader societal trends. Right? It certainly reflects broad societal pressures and incentive structures, and we'll get there. In 2014, so this was after the global meltdown, but before the current measles outbreak, Rosenstein wrote, "In recent years, ethical violations have become more publicized, with public disquiet seeming to reach a tipping point to create widespread distrust of professional practices in government institutions, centers of higher learning." So this is before the measles outbreak, but it's after the global meltdown. We do have a crisis of public trust. So the question is why, as researchers, or as anyone, researchers, practitioners, why should we care about the public trust as opposed to just plodding along doing our jobs? And this is one example. Public trust really matters. It matters in a number of ways. It matters, some of my other work is looking at public perceptions of recycled water. You need public approvals to build the water recycling plants, to conserve water if you're in the American Southwest or any number of places on the globe. You can't get approvals. You can't do things without some degree of public trust, public approval. And we have a crisis of public trust. And this is one of the outcomes of them. The No Vaccines for me is actually an instructional book for kids. I was not happy to find that. Still, in that public perceptions of recycled water work that I've done with Paul Rozin and Paul Slovic and Brent Haddad a few years ago, we found that even though there's a problem in terms of how much people trust scientists, they still trust scientists more than just about anyone else. So on a 1 to 10 scale, who would you trust to affirm that recycled water was in fact safe for you to drink? These are the numbers. An actor, you wouldn't trust very much. Staff of a facility for purification, you trust 4.67 on a 10-point scale. The highest number is the qualified university scientist. So this is a fabulous thing. On the other hand, it doesn't even reach 7 out of 10 points in terms of trustworthiness. Yeah. Okay, so big part of MeRTEC's origin is based on the premise that current approaches to ethics training are insufficient. And there are a number of ways in which they're insufficient. So first of all, many academic curricula entirely lack any sort of ethics training requirement. Now, if you're in occupational therapy or in clinical psychology or in medicine, we hope that you have an ethics course, and general accreditation guidelines require that. But many curricula do not require ethics at all. One of the things that the rector of Reykjavik University would like to do is institute an ethics requirement. It's currently not required. USN has a core ethics requirement. That's fabulous. You have to take an ethics course of some type to graduate from USM, but even when that's a requirement, the courses are often very general. You can take a philosophy course that they're worthwhile, fabulous courses, but they stay in the clouds and rarely get applied into daily life scenarios. And I apologize if I've offended any philosophers here. Or you can take a narrow, special topic-focused course. So one of the courses that meets our ethics requirement is focused on ethical issues in South Africa during apartheid. It's a great course. It's very worthwhile, but it's not exactly the ethical decision-making type course that we're talking about, people needing to make daily decisions in everyday life. In STEM curricula, professional ethics is generally intended to be a part of most curricula when it is included, which it often is. It's included tucked into research methods course. So you get 1 or 2 classes, unless they run out of time and kind of slide off the agenda. So that's very narrow, that's very time limited, and it's not going to do the job to prepare you for a real life situation in a laboratory or an everyday situation where there is complexity and you need to make a good ethical decision. Most professional ethics trainings, I'm thinking of, forgive me for mentioning it, IRB folks, the CITI training. That is the state of the art for responsible conduct of research training at the moment in terms of requirements. And it's focused on historical context. Why do we have ethics education? Why do we have rules and regulation? Worth knowing about. It's also focused on rule acquisition. What are the regulations? What should you do and not do? What is ethical and not ethical? And that's great, except that it's not sufficient. You need to go past that. So it's good for helping people walk through decisions about specific regulations. It seems to have some less good side effects, which I'll talk about in the next slide. I just want to mention that bright spot, those professional clinical training programs, nursing, OT, clinical psych, I'm sure there are others, actually have courses that focus on something called the reflective practitioner model. And the reflective practitioner model focuses on self-awareness. Awareness of your own processes as a practitioner. And that starts to creep into the realm of what I'll be talking about later, metacognition, which we think is really core to understanding how to teach ethics. So there are bright spots, not fully integrated yet. Okay, conclusion. Existing education tends to be too abstract, too narrow, too patchy, too rule-focused, or not there at all, right? A focus on rule awareness does in fact increase decision-making around the rules, but it doesn't do much for helping people weigh harms and benefits, engage in perspective taking. In fact, some research, so Antes et al. In 2010, I haven't seen a follow-up on this, but there's at least one, I think, well-conducted study that showed that there are actually negative impacts of doing rule-based training, not just RCR, but rule-based training in general, which is most common what's out there. My take on it is that it seems to boost confidence. You think you know the rules, and therefore you engage in less consultation. Rule number 1 in clinical training programs about ethics is go talk to people. Talk to people, consult, don't make the decision on your own. Speak with people, process, get multiple perspectives. So they're less likely to do that. It decreases help-seeking behavior. It decreases understanding of other people's perspectives. That's, again, probably overconfidence. And other aspects of pro-social behavior. So it's necessary, it's a good first step, but it's definitely not sufficient. And here's where we get to the work that we're doing at MeRTEC. Although I'm going to do a quick historical foray too. What is missing in ethics education? So Bruce Thompson, my closest colleague at USM, is a developmental psychologist who focuses on the acquisition, the development, the training of metacognitive skills. And what I do is I study irrational thinking processes. I study cognitive heuristics. And both of us see these at work all the time in daily life, and we see missing skills and missing concepts in people engaging in heuristic-based processing instead of full-fledged reasoning. So what we think is going on is that ethics training in general, with that little exception of certain professional training programs, it misses entirely training metacognitive awareness, these deeper psychological processes that are integrative. You've heard of executive functioning, you know, when people have attention deficit disorder. Executive functioning is what takes a hit. The frontal lobes are not fully mature. Metacognitive skills have to do with integrating all of that sort of higher cognitive function, including executive function. Not only integrating them to work together, but also being able to think about those skills as they are unfolding, reflect on your own thinking. I also think, we both also think, that if you don't teach people specifically about what happens when they are engaged in decision-making under conditions of stress, if you don't teach them about the different types of thought process that we are pre-programmed to engage in, they're going to be sitting ducks. Because the older, the archaic type of thinking reaches up, grabs you, and takes over, as it is designed to do. It's for emergency situations. And if you're stressed, your mind functions as though it's an emergency situation. And finally, we spend a little less time on this because some other researchers are already focusing on it. We think that ethics education very rarely focuses enough attention on the important influence of social factors, like norms, social norms. Recently, federal funding agencies are focusing more on that, funding research on how you can create cultures of ethical behavior. But if you think about the power of norms in everyday life, people are social creatures, and to get somebody to violate their local norm takes a lot of courage, and there are penalties for doing it. So we'll get to that in a little bit. Questions so far? Comments? Expressions of, yes?
The idea of teaching metacognition.
Yeah, I can hear you, but I think nobody, yeah.
The idea of teaching metacognition.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah.
The idea of teaching metacognition is that I'm just thinking about like typically developing populations versus populations of people with diminished executive function in the first place, like autism and things like that. Is that equally as successful?
Now, this is Bruce Thompson's field, so I don't know, but I haven't actually seen any literature on teaching executive functions in context of daily decision-making to people with autism. I presume that that would be much more challenging, but there is a neurophysiological basis to the development of metacognition. I don't think I have a slide showing them, but the temporoparietal junction and one other brain region. So they're very sensitive to learning in context. They are trainable skills. My guess is that with things like, okay, I'm going off on a complete foray here, increasing use of things like electrical stimulation, that you could probably eventually bolster those at the neurophysiological level as well. But so the short answer is, we know that you can train it for typically developing populations. We also know that it does not necessarily get all the way to the final goal for everyone in life. It's developing into early adulthood, and people stop at various levels along the way, and even when they achieve good levels of metacognitive abilities, they don't necessarily use them in everyday situations. And I would imagine that people with executive function disorders and other such disorders would require a lot more training. So we're going for the general population, though, at this point. Yeah. Do you have a specific reason for, I mean, was that just curiosity, or is it applied specifically to ethics as you're thinking about it?
It's partly just general curiosity, but also, you know, watching my own child go through learning how to make decisions as an adolescent,
Yeah.
and then learning how to make decisions as an adolescent with the added layer of having some executive function diminished.
Right.
It's, you know, your average 15-year-old doesn't make great decisions to start off with.
Their frontal lobes are being disassembled to be rewired, so yeah. Yeah. So the brain is a fundamentally programmable organ. That's its whole purpose, is to be continually programmed and reprogrammed through environmental input. But it might take a lot more effort in that case, I would say. Yeah. Thank you. Okay. Okay, so why do people engage in misconduct? And I'm going to go through a couple of these very quickly and then land on the last one. So the first, historically, the first approach to thinking about why people engage in misconduct is the bad apple or the bad actor approach. Largely, we've moved past that. second view, and this is what resulted in all of the mandated trainings, which we do in fact need, is the idea that people engage in misconduct when they don't know the rules. But now we've moved to much more focus on social context. So that's a current and an emerging model. Social context, norms, culture of a lab. The one kind of spreading out sideways from the social context approach is one that I distinguish. It's called incentive structures. I don't know that people are calling it that. I do. I'm trained also in my clinical training as a behavioral psychologist, and so focusing on environmental contingencies, the consequences of behavior, is a big focus in my training background. And so, yes, there are consequences linked to norms, but incentive structures themselves can be distinct from norms, so I think they're separable. For instance, in their autonomic nervous system reactivity, their fight or flight response, they don't respond to punishment in the same way as neurotypical people. So that focused on identifying, catching, and penalizing the bad guys, right? And a quote from Resnick is that according to this theory, most scientists are highly ethical, only researchers who are morally corrupt, economically desperate, or psychologically disturbed commit misconduct. No, no, not true. It would be nice, but no. There are bad apples. There certainly are people who intentionally do things, but that's in no way the majority of what goes on that results in misconduct. Ignorance of the rules. People violate rules and engage in misconduct because they're not familiar with them, and we can kind of skip past this one, but because the idea here is that many of the deviations that occur simply occur because people don't know they're violating the rules. So this is why city training is mandated. It used to be NIH training that was mandated. You need to know some of the rules in order to know when you're violating them. Yes?
So I'm getting a little stuck here, and I know you talked about this a bit earlier, but on the distinction between ethical lapses and regulatory lapses. Because it seems to me that something like ignorance of the rules only applies to regulatory lapses and not ethical lapses. And you seem to still be kind of putting those two categories together. And I'm just wondering if you could say a little bit more about that and the similarities and distinctions between them.
How long do we have? So I might throw the question back at you to begin with those. So are you arguing that violating a rule, a regulation that seems untethered to ethics is different qualitatively? Is that?
Yeah, so I guess I would say two things. One is that there may be regulations that are untethered to ethical decisions, and one could violate those unintentionally. But two, there may be situations, sort of like an unjust laws exist situation, where actually the ethical decision might be in contrast to the regulatory decision.
I'm not going to address it right here in relation to this slide particularly, but that is the core. It's really the heart and soul of the approach that we want to develop to teaching ethical resolutions, because by definition, if you're in an ethical dilemma, which happens, it's because there are competing ethical principles or there are competing needs of multiple stakeholders. And so that's part of that complexity, that cognitive load, and that emotionality. So, sorry. So yeah, I think that's a really important aspect. We could argue that in a system that depends on following the rules, any violation of a rule is an ethical breach, unless there is a clear countervailing tendency. Like, you know, do I speed on any given day on the road? I inherited my father's heavy foot on the gas. I try really hard not to, thank God for cruise control. But it's a small violation, and maybe there's a countervailing one that you really need to get somewhere fast so something bad doesn't happen. But if people in general don't follow the rule, people will die. There will be car accidents, there will be chaos. So there's still a value in people following a consistent set of rules, even if you can't clearly see why they're there. And I would argue that if you see a rule that seems to be counterproductive in terms of its ethical foundations, you should first try and understand where the rule came from, because often that clarifies the function of it. And then if you really think it's not serving its purpose anymore, that's the time to learn how to change the rules. So this is part of the MeRTEC regulatory navigator training. So it's a great question. Does that answer sufficiently for now? Okay, cool. Thank you for the question. Okay, so, well, the other thing, though, is that there are changing practices. So One of the reasons for focusing on rules, regulations, is, for instance, I'm going to take the example of the senior member of a lab being automatically put on all publications. That used to be just commonplace and accepted. And now it is, I remember the first time I saw it, I was teaching graduate level ethics at Arizona State University, and I saw that it was now, it's considered unethical, and I screeched to a cognitive halt and thought, uh-oh, how many people, good people, do I know who do this just because it's the way it's done? So that sort of training, as things are updated, learning the rules is important. Although, again, I would argue you have to go deeper behind that to look at what the function is of the rule and why it's unethical and so on. Yeah. Okay, so the third explanation is bad social norms. And here's where we have to keep in mind that all ethical decision-making and pretty much everything else in life unfolds within a sociocultural context. So 3 different definitions of norms. I'm going to step back so I can read them properly. The first one on the left is from anthropology and sociology. It's that norms are spoken and unspoken cultural products. They develop and they're fostered by group customs, traditions, and values. You can map this onto any lab situation, any teaching situation, any professional practice, right? They're all going to have their own norms. And these cultural products dictate what is and is not appropriate behavior, right? So that's the anthropology and the sociology explanation. My former colleague Bob Cialdini from Arizona State University put it in social psychology terms, which I find a bit clearer. And he said their basic knowledge that individuals possess about how other people behave and our ideas about how others expect us to behave. Right. Bob Cialdini is one of these international high-profile experts on social norms and influence. Then there's an emerging, most of the cognitive approaches, cognitive psychology approaches I would characterize as emerging, that describes norms as internalized schematic information. What does that mean? Internalized means we've taken them in and integrated them into our way of thinking. Schematic information, they're the templates that guide our thinking about things. And if they're triggered by environmental cues. They're cues in the environment that clue us into what norms are active in any given situation. If you've ever traveled to a foreign country that is significantly different culturally from your own, you are likely to feel like a fish out of water briefly because you can't read the cues. You don't even know what the cues are. And if you do notice the cues, you say, well, I know something is going on, but I have no idea what to do about it. So, social cues. So your schema might be activated, or it might not even be activated, but if it is activated, you have no idea what to do about it. So that's the cognitive processing approach. When norms are triggered by cues, this is really important. The cognitive approach, and also Bob Cialdini's approach, points out that your behavior that results from responding to norms is automatic. You can say to yourself, wow, everybody else is wearing such and such. I guess I better look like everybody else. You can do that, but in general, you respond automatically. This is built into us as social creatures, is to respond to norms. So they're habitual, they're reflexive, they're automatic, they're very often not consciously processed at all. And the social psychology research, predominantly Cialdini's work with 1,015,000 colleagues, says that even very subtle cues, tiny little cues that don't cost much money, can have major effects. So you don't even need to invest a lot of money to sensitively manipulate people's behavior through controlling these cues. And they are likely to not even notice you're doing it. So he's done studies on litter, on graffiti, on mental and physical health cues. He's run norming campaigns pertaining to smoking on campuses, drinking on campuses. Did you know most college students don't, in fact, drink alcohol? Norming campaign, plastered all over it's true, it happens to be true. But there's an expectation, actually, on most college campuses that everybody drinks, right? Which people then feel they might need to live up to. So, best way to keep the New York City subway system clean of litter and graffiti? Clean it. That's what turned it around. It was a disaster in the through the 1980s, 70s certainly. And through understanding the use of social norms, and I think Bob Cialdini may have been involved in this. I know he's involved in litter campaigns all over the world. You clean the subways, you clean the graffiti, and people don't litter in a pristine environment because the norm is to not litter. If you let the graffiti build up, everybody will jump on it. There will be litter everywhere, but if you clean it every time something happens, pretty soon you don't need to clean anything anymore because it stops happening. So very, very powerful. Obviously, ethical behavior that's unfolding is going to be sensitively cued to norms. Do I put somebody on the publication? Do I not put somebody on the publication? What's the norm, right? Okay, and then we move to incentives, and there's a lot of attention focused on incentives, and for good reason. Yes, sorry.
Sorry, I can't resist this one.
Go for it.
The British people have this they feel self-righteous about how good they are at queuing up, lining up, waiting in turn. But I'm sorry to report that it's absolute twaddle. That's not true at all. Because you go to London and to the airport, people are pushing and they are fighting to get on to the public transport. So that social norm, which is supposed to be so ingrained into our psychology and feeling of like patriotic pride, actually breaks down completely. But then I get really annoyed by this, and I'll actually stand there and start directing people, and quite bossily. Sometimes I'll do it. My wife gets absolutely mortified, and I'll just say, you need to wait. You need to start waiting your turn. What is it about this situation that stops you from now deciding that you don't have to wait your turn anymore? So the only reason I explain that is that I think it kind of fits in really well that how a social norm can be completely gone. The extreme of a social norm can be completely nullified if a few people decide that there's just not something they need to do anymore.
And that's related to the incentive structure. So a couple of questions that I would consider are, has this changed? Did people queue up really well in the 1940s and 50s, maybe through the 60s, and then it changed, and if so, when and why? Is it related to becoming a more and more multicultural society where people come in with different norms? The first time I traveled in the Middle East, I'm from Canada. Now, Montreal, which is only sort of Canada, but and I talk with my hands, as you probably noticed. The first time I went to the Middle East, and nobody lined up for anything, we don't call it queuing, it was shocking to me, and I had no idea. It took me three buses would go by before I succeeded in getting on one. And then when I came back to Canada, the norms there seemed incredibly restrictive and annoying. So when you bring a lot of people, though, into multicultural contact, those norms that are there, those cues that are there that have always been there, do in fact shift. And I would argue that that's one of the difficulties people have with large waves of immigration. Yes?
I think this actually relates really nicely to an example you used earlier when you talked about measles outbreaks. And so the idea that when you have an availability of philosophical exemptions in certain states, it's, you have a small group of people who decide they're not going to go along with it, succeed in getting it, past legislation, and then once people see that checkbox is there, they're more likely to engage in it, whereas before they wouldn't have thought twice about it. It's, well, my kid has to go to school, they have to be vaccinated, that's how it is. And then once that norm is removed, and once it's like, well, there's an option, so maybe I should think about this and look into it more, and then you get sucked into terrible internet sites, and it's actually a terrific. I know you brought it up in a different context,
well,
but it's a terrific example of this too.
Yeah, and that's a fabulous application of this, and that's like plenty of metacognition there. I'm really happy. Originally, I think the exemption started for religious reasons, and if you think about Jehovah's Witnesses, for example, there's a line in the Old Testament that says, the soul is in the blood. And if you think from that perspective, the idea of taking somebody else's soul into you through a blood transfusion, that's pretty heinous. You wouldn't want to do that if that is your belief system. So it's one of these things that had its origin, and you can see its function, but then it broadened and broadened, and you're absolutely right that the question on the questionnaires cues you that there are options which shifts the direction of your thinking. Yeah, and now philosophical is very broad. Oh, I'm a little worried about giving this thing. But there are a number of cognitive heuristics that we're going to talk about that also point to discomfort with vaccines. So it's a great catch. Other comments, questions? Okay. So the incentives explanation, this is where a classical behaviorist approach tells us we should look at the environmental contingencies. Behavior is very, very sensitive to environmental contingencies. This works whether you're a sea slug or a rat or a person. It also works for cats, contrary to popular belief. You put the tuna in the right spot, the cat's going to do what you want. It might not want you to notice it. You might have to look away, but it'll work. So according to the stressful or imperfect environment theory, and that's not a behaviorist phrasing of it, but it's the same concept, The idea is that misconduct will occur because the environment is set up. There are institutional pressures, there are incentives, there are constraints that encourage people to commit misconduct. So if you know that if you massage that data just the teensiest little bit, you're going to get that publication, and the publication will lead to the grant, and the grant will lead to tenure, and the tenure means that you're going to be able to stay in this country and not uproot your family, and you'll have a livelihood. Again, I'm giving a research misconduct example, but you could do examples for any number of fields. The incentives are sometimes huge to engage in problematic behavior. The payoffs can be very high if you are not caught and penalized for it. And the costs of doing the right thing are sometimes also rather high. So the challenge for if you're looking at an institutionally social context model, the challenge is for institutions to figure out how to set up an incentive structure that rewards people for doing the right thing instead of the wrong thing. And of course that links to publication practices and granting bodies, and it's a complicated thing to take on, yes.
So it occurs to me that on top of this, you have a layer of, in the grant situation, for example, scarcity of resources, which of course adds a tremendous amount of pressure to everything. And so has anyone looked at this dramatic rise that you were reporting at the beginning in context to grant funding?
I have not seen actual empirical data on that. I have seen a link drawn. People say, yes, it's probably, or in scarce resources, there's more competition, and competition is linked to more misconduct. But I haven't seen people actually linking, number. It's a great study if you want to do that, I'm sure. I'm pretty sure. Yeah. Well, again, there's a lot of interest in this. There are new publications, so, if we're aiming for tenure, grant funding, it's a good field. There are incentives. So in 2013, so a few years ago now, though, Gino and colleagues did a study on undergrad. It was students. I forget if it was undergraduates or graduates. They did a series of 3 experimental studies, and in one of them, in the first one, they increased, immediately before administering an in-class exam, they made salient the benefits of cheating. I don't remember the exact method, it's been a while since I read it, but something along the lines of saying, yeah, well, if anybody cheated on this, they would just completely blow the curve and look like an absolute superstar, something like that. You make salient what the benefits of cheating would be, and the students take the exam, and guess what? There's more cheating, because you made salient the rewards. The other interesting thing they found in the second study was that when people are intending to cheat, right? They know they're planning to do this thing, this violation, and before they do it, a priori, they actually engage in, they call them psychological adjustments. So they're working with their own head to rationalize in advance why it's going to be okay to do this thing that they're doing, right? This will make sense. You've got 2 different minds, at least. You've got many different minds. But one mind is on board with doing something, and the other mind has to kind of get itself aligned with that, right? So in other words, if you exposed people to the potential benefits of unethical behavior, they rationalize their decision beforehand as justified. And when they phrase things in terms of altruism, in other words, doing this thing, even though it's a little sketchy, will actually benefit people, it'll benefit your colleagues, it'll benefit society. If you can just bring this to publication or bring this drug to market, many people will benefit. That increased this. That made it much more powerful, in effect. So Freud was right. Freud was right about a lot of things. Okay, and here's, yes.
Thanks. This is fascinating. I just came from a social norms marketing session it's going on right now in Portland, down our Portland campus, by Michael Haynes.
Okay.
I don't know if you know him, but
no, but I would like to.
Yeah, it was great. And so I'm wondering, built on his perspective, which is essentially if you promote the behavior that's the proper behavior that's being done by people in a group, which they have identified themselves, the college students who are not drinking, for example, that behavior increases. So I'm wondering in terms, the desired behavior.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering in this one, has anyone done an experiment, and I probably could do this research if you think that's a good idea, done the opposite of right before an exam promoting the benefits of ethical behavior, and to see how that results?
It's possible. I mean, it's been probably a couple of years since I updated this specific search, so it's possible. At the time, 2 years ago, as of 2 years ago, no. But that sort of thing is used routinely in, say, clinical context. So norming campaigns, we know they're really powerful, which is why you've got all those cues to hand washing all over every healthcare setting now. They work. You know, it's minimal cost. You put up a few signs, and then you remove the barrier. There's a health psychology model that also talks about benefits and barriers. So you remove the barrier by putting the hand sanitizer right there, right? And then you create a norm by telling people, if you didn't see your healthcare provider, you know, sanitize their hands, report. So they're very powerful. I have no reason to expect that it wouldn't work, but I haven't seen a study. But if you want to do one, collaboration would be fun. Yeah. And maybe I can catch you after to find out more about his talk. Yeah. Okay, so cognitive processing, this is, I call for this talk, I decided to call it the MeRTEC model, but we're just making it up, so it isn't officially recognized as the MeRTEC model yet. Our premise is that a big drawback to most ethics education approaches right now is that they underestimate profoundly, or don't consider at all, how extensively human beings rely on intuitive processing and emotion-based reasoning. We do walk around there assuming people are rational, and we really are not very rational. So I've alluded to this a couple of times. If you're really thinking about it the right way, most ethical dilemmas, most ethical decision-making, if you're engaging in the decision at all, or people are telling you should be, chances are there's something tricky about it. Chances are it's complex. Usually, you can be very clear about what principles are relevant, but those principles might lead you to different outcomes. Usually, depending on who you focus, whose needs you focus on, and how broadly you cast your net considering who the stakeholders are who are relevant, you will come up with completely different outcomes. And it's unfolding usually with incomplete information, uncertainty, time pressures, and very high stakes. So this is a really complex thing, and we are, as human beings, ill-equipped really to handle it without some significant coaching and support. Under this sort of condition, this is exactly the sort of condition in which you get what's called type 1 processing. I'll get to that on the next slide. And the type 1 processing is filled with systematic biases. They are systematic, they're predictable. You can tell in advance if you understand these things, if you understand the heuristics that'll be called forth. You can often predict which direction thinking is going to go squirrely. And what we argue, what we're starting to argue, is that we need to educate people about what those biases are. When this type of thinking will be triggered, what specific biases to be on the lookout for, which conditions are likely to trigger them so you know to look and to be self-aware. And then we need to support people by helping them develop the type of metacognitive skills to catch them and to override them. So you need to recognize them, you need to have the self-regulatory skills to, instead of leaping to rationalize your behavior, to actually say, whoa, that is a distortion, and then you need to override them. And that's a tall order. So, just, I could have made this much more, there are a lot of examples, just watch the news or anything. So most cognitive and social cognitive theorists at this point acknowledge that there are at least two distinct, well, they settle on two distinct modes of thinking. We have two minds. And are you familiar with the book by Dan Gilbert, Thinking Fast and Slow? This is exactly what he's talking about. So type 1 thinking is the intuitive thinking. It's the default mode. And this is where most of the work that I did for the first 20 years of my career fell, focusing on what we now term a cognitive heuristic called magical contagion, the intuitive contagion concept. And that type of thinking is characterized as rapid. It happens rapidly. It happens automatically. It is emotion-based thinking. Whenever anything is emotional, boom, this type of thinking is triggered. It's undifferentiated. So for example, in what I study, magical contagion, it's a very blurry concept. There's not a lot of precision about it. And type 1 thinking really is focused on, it works with concrete imagery and narrative. So when I'm talking about needing to use case scenarios with vivid, imaginable content, this is why. We need to get both brains working here together. So intuitive or type 1 thinking versus rational or type 2 thinking, that's the effortful model. It's slow, it's effort intensive, it's reflective, it's deliberate. This stuff takes time, this stuff takes effort, it sucks up your working memory resources and just about every other type of self-control imaginable. It does use abstract and differentiated symbols, it's fabulous for science, it's not good for making snap decisions. So to back up just a little bit to 1980, Nisbet and Ross introduced an idea that is now foundational to type 1 thinking, but at the time, only Freud had really drawn that distinction. He talked about primary process and secondary process thinking. So Nisbet and Ross started out with the analogy, and most people don't read this, it's in the preface to their book. Before you even get to the introduction, they said, you know, the visual system is hardwired, right? And the way it's hardwired is it has to construct some sort of a coherent visual world out of the mess that actually reaches your retina. Because the receptors are on the very back of your retina, and in between the outside world and your retina, aside from the cornea and the lens, you've got jelly, you've got cross connections, receptors, floaters. You've got a blind spot in there where the optic nerve comes. It's a mess. And somehow your brain has to construct a coherent world out of that mess. And so that's what the programming is for. That's what the wiring is for. And that's great. Usually it works just great. But occasionally it results in visual illusions, which are compelling. They're automatic. They're not conscious. They're compelling. And they say, you know what? The cognitive system does the same thing. Does just the same thing. It's also hardwired with these rules of thumb, these things called heuristics, cognitive heuristics. They save time. They save effort. They don't take a lot of effort to use. They happen fast. They're generally adaptive, right? But occasionally they're going to get fooled. Occasionally you need to use the other type of thinking. And the pictures that I have there are, if you think about our evolutionary history, if the person sitting at the bottom there takes enough time to think through every possibility for how to defend himself against or hunt for the creature that's trying to hunt him, he is going to be eaten and dead. So it's not going to work. You can't take all that time in many everyday situations. So what does it have to do with ethics? This is probably pretty obvious. Emotional content, high stakes, they evoke what's been called, starting in 1963 with Abelson, but for decades after that, the idea of hot cognition as opposed to cold cognition. Cold cognition is when you can sit back and rationally think things through with your type 2 processing, with leisure time, with lots of information, lots of effort, you're well rested, you're not freaked out. As opposed to hot cognition, where your lower level thinking is going, ah! And you have to respond now, before you actually know what's going on. And even if you could take the time, you actually don't want to because you're in emergency mode. So a lot of ethical decision making unfolds that way, which is why it's really good to slow down and consult with other people who are less freaked out than you, for instance. In everyday life, this is important. Intuitive processing is thought to typically override rational thinking. And that's where I gave you this example of, okay, I know I'm going to engage in this violation. My gut is saying, yeah, do it. My head tends to get brought on board to justify and rationalize as opposed to override. So again, this requires, we can screech to a halt, slow down, and override. We have the capacity, but it might take some practice depending on the circumstances. Does this make sense so far? Okay, I'm seeing some furrowed brows. Is that because you're really interested or because, yeah, okay. They turned to smiles, we're good. So, how am I doing on time? I have a million heuristics I could go through. I'm going to go through 3, and then I'll probably get a copy of the slides and can go through the others. But the one that is particularly relevant, I would say, is the affect heuristic, affect meaning emotional or mood state, by Paul Rozin and colleagues. Paul Rozin has been writing about cognitive heuristics since the notion was first introduced. So the idea behind the affect heuristic is that whatever your positive or negative feelings are about something, they replace logical analysis, right, of its merits. So for example, if you have positive feelings about your boss, let's just imagine you have positive feelings about your boss. You see the cup up there says world's greatest boss. You might just do what they say without stopping or slowing down or saying, are you sure that's a good idea? You might forget to be a check on the boss, right? Another example of that might be positive feelings about your own research. Why do people have blind spots so that they can't see the ethical dilemmas in their own research? Why do we have IRBs? I'm not trying to publicize, oh great, IRBs are fabulous, But really, the purpose of having an independent group of people review all research protocols is not to say all researchers are jerks or unethical. It's simply that having independent people, new sets of eyes, and ideally multiple sets of eyes, catch things that you are unlikely to catch because you have positive feelings about your own research and things are going to slip. Similarly, though, if somebody on the committee is looking at your blood draw section of your protocol and they're blood injection injury phobic, they might have a problem with your whole protocol. Right? So it's an affect heuristic. It's a heuristic because the intuitive rule of thumb substitutes for your actual logical analysis. Right? And what you want to do there is catch that, slow down, and engage in the logical analysis. Does that make sense? Probably one of the most powerful versions, framing. Are we familiar with framing? I know you are, Beck. But Tversky and Kahneman started talking about framing in, maybe 1981 was the first time. They came up with something called the Asian disease example. In framing, what we're doing, we constantly navigate through life framing things into and out of our awareness. We can't have everything in our consciousness and our attentional focus all the time. Contagion is a great example. I couldn't touch anything in this room if I focused on the likelihood of germs from however many people have been through here. I have to screen that out of my awareness on an ongoing basis. And environmental cues can screen it back in. If somebody was hacking or coughing, I might start to think, germs. But we frame all the time. And they came up with this thing called the Asian disease problem. It's not intended to be racist. It was simply an example of a disease that starts in Asia. And back in 1981, before SARS, actually. And here's the example they give people. They give people this scenario. You've got a group of 600 people, and you have a choice between implementing two different programs. If you implement program A, 200 people are definitely going to be saved. If you implement program B, there's a 1/3 probability that all of them will be saved and a 2/3 probability that nobody will be saved. If you frame it that way, if you present the information that way, 72% of people choose program A. Right? Are we familiar with this? Have we ever seen this before? No, okay. On the other hand, you can give the same people or different sets of people an example of program C versus D. In program C, 400 people are going to die. In program D, there's a 1/3 probability that nobody's going to die and a 2/3 probability that everybody will die. And now 78% prefer program D. So for people who are very, very numbers savvy, a couple of you are smiling. Now, what just happened before I go to the next slide? It's exactly the same. Yeah, it's exactly the same probabilities. But the preference is completely reversed, right? And the question is why? And the answer is that it evoked different heuristics because of the way it was framed. So well, that's not all that visible, is it? The framing of the question in terms of gain, saving lives, results in a preference for certainty. Whereas the framing of the question in terms of how many lives will be lost evokes a heuristic of loss aversion. So now you prefer the gamble, the uncertainty, and it completely reduces preferences. Very compelling. I mean, people can look at this, see the statistical probability is the same, but it doesn't get rid of the preference necessarily. So good catch, though. What gets framed in and framed out of our ethical analysis? All kinds of things. Anxiety, one of the impacts of the fight or flight system being activated is that it narrows your attentional focus. So you're likely, the more anxious you are, the more likely you are to miss important things. I'm going to give one more example of a contagion heuristic and then kind of skip over the others, although you can look at the slides later if you want. This is my own research, and the contagion heuristic, that is a very, very old way of thinking. I call it magical contagion because if you look at magical practices and folk beliefs from all across the world, this is one of anthropologist Sir James Fraser's original laws of sympathetic magic. It is a cognitive principle underlying a lot of the practices. But it's a heuristic. So in this heuristic, physical contact is taken as a proxy for route or mode of contamination. So contact causes influence. If I were to touch Liam, maybe his hair would grow, for instance, right? Because influence gets transmitted. So I can do that because I know you well. Biomedical contagion, people say, well, how is this different from germ theory? Well, it is and it isn't. Germ theory, biomedical contagion, is an empirically validated subcase of this older, broader heuristic. So the intuitive contagion concept has specific features that clash with biomedical germ theory, and it applies to many more things. So it's less differentiated in that all kinds of things are transmissible. I made the joke about hair. It used to be a better joke when the hair was like out to here before there were good hair products. But all kinds of things in the undifferentiated, in the intuitive concept, are considered transmissible. Goodness is transmissible. Evil is transmissible. Physical manifestations are transmissible. And they can be negative or positive characteristics that are transmissible. So it's a really undifferentiated concept. Two principles that go along with it are kind of interesting. It's holographic in that if I touch something, contact, right? A little bit of stuff transmitted is every bit as bad as a lot of stuff transmitted. So when I was doing early work on HIV prevention, and I said, how would you feel about one HIV virus getting into your blood system versus 100 versus 10,000 versus a million? You find that people don't care how many. One is really, really bad, and it's almost as bad as a million. And people scrawled in the margins things like, they breed, you know, right? So complete lack of sensitivity to the idea of dose responsivity. Vaccines are a perfect example of this. I'm trying to remember who it was who, oh yes, measles. Yeah. It's a perfect example. You've got the stuff, the evil stuff that causes the disorder. Yes, it's dead, but you know what? Dead doesn't actually matter. For some people, even burning something to ash, you still get contagion effects. It's permanent. That's another feature. And you're putting that stuff in your healthy child. And then, worse yet, they're going to manifest some of the symptoms of it. Well, it's actually immune activation, but details, right? We're talking about heuristic thinking, right? You are what you eat. If I eat something, that's the most contagious contact imaginable, right? So it was completely predictable a few years ago when we had swine flu going around, and the news outlets were calling it swine flu, and I'm thinking, everybody's going to start not eating pork, which is exactly what happened, and shortly thereafter they switched to its actual name. So this is the magical contagion heuristic. There are a few more. Familiarity and risk avoidance. But I'm looking at the time, and I should wrap up so we can have more discussion. Familiar risks are minimized. If you have been doing something forever, even if it's risky, if you're irradiating people at relatively high levels, but you've done it a lot, and nobody's ever died yet, it's going to seem less risky. People adapt to all kinds of things just through familiarity. And this is, again, pre-programmed. If you think about what we're sensitive to, if something is changing, moving rapidly, that's what our entire attentional system is geared to notice. If it's staying the same, pretty soon we stop paying attention to it. It's not a threat. It hasn't killed us yet. Is it irrational? Sort of. It's one of those usually good enough rules of thumb that sometimes is really, really wrong. Right? And we exaggerate responses to dread risks. That, again, is Paul Slovik and Bruch Fischoff's work. So if things are poorly understood, if they evoke feelings of dread, if they involve large numbers of people, nuclear meltdowns, plane crashes, then you get exaggerated dread. HIV in its first days, I was working in hospital settings in the 1980s, and oh my goodness, people lost their minds or reverted to their older minds, which is really what happened. Okay, quick anecdote. I saw an attending physician chewing out a resident as they came out of the hospital room of a person who had AIDS. And there were all kinds of signs on the door. This was a psychiatric unit at the time. Signs on the door saying precautions, masks, gloves, particular precautions around blood draws. And the resident came out and was holding up a vial of blood that he'd just drawn. He wasn't wearing gloves or a mask or anything. And the attending freaked out. And I heard, as I was walking down the hallway, the resident say, well, it's okay. I'm not a drug abuser or homosexual. Medical degree. So, but everybody, no matter how educated you are, you still got that older mind. And usually that older mind is not only active, but it's doing a pretty good job for you, except when it's not. Okay, so is metacognition the solution? And this is why I think we really need to understand, before we leap into training metacognition, I really think Bruce loves metacognition, and so he wants to just teach it. I think you first have to teach what it is you need to metacognate about. Right? So the likelihood is that metacognition is in fact the solution. Metacognition is defined as the uniquely human capacity to reflect on thought itself. These are Bruce's slides. I love how he presents things. And the idea is it's a loosely associated a set of integrative, very high-level skills. Executive functioning is actually lower-level skill than metacognition. Metacognition would be when you think about your own executive functioning, your ability to understand the process of your own thinking process. So the human capacity to reflect on thought itself, including awareness of the fact that you're doing that, and including awareness of how other people are thinking and how they're thinking about you. So it's very meta, 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 meta. It has a neurophysiological basis. Oh, yeah, there's a typo in there, I apologize. But it's also very highly sensitive to learning and socialization. So it is definitely trainable. There's extensive evidence showing that it's trainable. And it has a specific developmental sequence. So it goes from implicit metacognition, which is, oh, I know this thing, to explicit or declarative metacognition, which is, I know why I forgot. Next time, let's put a cue, right? What we're working with teenagers on right now, to the fully formed meta-procedural reasoning. I know that what I know about how to do this can also help me over here. I know that my advanced rational thinking over here is called for when I'm doing my ethical analysis. And I know that I'm likely to run into these problems, and so I have to be particularly self-aware, et cetera, et cetera. If Bruce were here, he would be talking about this for about 17 more slides, the way I did on the heuristics, but he's not, so we're going to be brief. Why is it important for ethical decision-making? It's the foundation for your logical critical thinking. It's what helps you control and self-regulate in terms of your own thinking and in terms of your emotional skills, right? So it's an integrative skill. I already said that. Right, so metacognition provides this capacity for self-reflection and self-monitoring and perspective taking. You don't only need to be able to be in your own head, you need to figure out how your research study or whatever you're doing is going, or your clinical practice, how your client, your patient is going to respond to it. I know that it's fine with me to do this. Is it fine with them to do this? How might they perceive it? What if they're from other cultures? And most importantly, we're reasonably sure that it's metacognition that allows people to become aware of and, when needed, compensate for and override the lower level type of thinking, those biases. So a couple of specific tools. I will leave like 5 minutes for questions anyway. We think you have to educate people about heuristics and hot cognition. We also think that you need to not only educate them about metacognition, but have them engage in lots and lots and lots and lots of practice. And part of the practice is using ethical decision-making models, and I won't follow the link here because I'm looking at the time, but you can follow the link. Ken Pope is a clinical psychologist who puts out phenomenal resources geared to helping people with ethical decision-making. So his site has an example of a beautiful ethical decision-making model. Step 1, step 2, step 3, think about this, define the problem, get consultation, who are the stakeholders, what are your alternative possibilities, what will the costs be to stakeholders, what will the benefits be to stakeholders, etc. And then finally, we think that we also need to borrow from the clinical psychology and the positive psychology literatures, a psychological inoculation literature, where you not only have people practice metacognition, but you have them practice a graded series of challenges of ethical opportunities for cheating, right? And you set them up so that they're likely to identify and successfully resolve a simple one before you move on to a more complicated one, and then a more complicated one. And with a psychological inoculation model, the idea here in other domains, what this does is it provides resilience in the face of future challenges. So if you then plop such a person into a lab where the norms are problematic, hopefully they will have ethical resilience. We're doing research. We've done a pilot project, a model workshop with researchers at the Research Integrity Symposium in 2017, the Maine Research Integrity Symposium. Current work, hopefully soon to be funded by the Office of Research Integrity, is to explore developmental career stage and also institutional context aspects to see how they shift people's metacognition and their heuristic-based thinking as they are thinking through, in a group setting, ethical dilemmas. And finally, there's a proposal under development to be submitted in like 3 months, designing an intervention study and comparing outcomes across multiple, to pull apart which features are necessary and useful. Thank you. That's it. Okay.
Thank you. So one of the things I was thinking about at the end is metacognition seems kind of like a type 2 style of thinking, the slow, the rational. And you were talking about ethical dilemmas often occurring in a type 1 situation, right, where there's a lot of emotions and a lot of pressure. And so I guess I'm wondering if you can talk more about that and how, I mean, that type 1 situation, I can end up using my type 2 thinking to solve the problem.
It is exactly right, and it's a great question. And the answer there is that our minds don't, they don't like run away out the door. They're still both in our head. And the question is, which one is activated and in prominence at any given time? And so, yes, our argument is that it's going to be evoking the type 1 thinking, but because we have access to the type 2 thinking, and the more practiced and trained and resilient it is, and the more trained on specifically thinking about ethics in type 2 fashion, that should be more easily brought. So if you have the awareness, the scanning, the reflective ability, you will say, oh, I'm probably engaging in some heuristic thinking right now because I'm stressed. Let's slow down and go through the sequence of steps. So it's exactly teaching people how to reactivate their type 2 mind as they're in type 1 panic mode is exactly what the focus of the training would be.
Does that mean that you think people know when they're making an ethical decision? Like, are people aware at that time?
That's actually a really great question. No, I don't think I think they often don't know. And that's where the missing chunk here, which we're going to integrate, but probably after we've done a little work on this, is what are the cues that will tell you when a situation is an ethical one? I mean, they're emotional cues, right? So give me an example of what you think people might miss when they're making an ethical, because an ethical dilemma, people generally know. They feel torn, they feel stressed.
Well, I was just reflecting on the fact that we think most people aren't bad actors, and therefore if they realized they were making an ethical decision and choosing perhaps the wrong side, they probably wouldn't be doing that. So these examples of where we see people making slips are probably areas where they didn't know or think to reflect on it, to seek out advice, right, and to therefore engage in their metacognition.
That's an empirical question. I think there's a lot more middle ground. You remember all those people who reported that they had personally engaged in questionable practices? They knew those practices were questionable. And they didn't slow down to really do the analysis or change, they knew they were questionable. So for not knowing the rules, we've got the standard rule-based training. This is for when you have a little bit of unease, or you think something's questionable, and the easy way to go in the incentive structures and with the norms and blah, blah, blah is not to make waves. That's that whole array of examples that I think we want people to slow down, recognize, hey, this is a hint. You've got that little unease, you're questioning whether it's shady or not. Stop, take time, reflect, and go through this analytical process. So, it's a great question. Yeah.
So, great talk. I'm a psychologist also. I have one comment, or two things quick. So, I've been rather disturbed in our language that we use on all kinds of issues, how the phrase "I feel" has been sort of extended to mean I think, I believe. And when I get, particularly with students, an I feel answer to something that's very concrete and much more thought or factually based, I challenge them, well, what's the emotion behind this? And the response I get is, I'm not talking about my feelings. So sometimes I think, but the two types of thinking you've been talking about, the first one is about emotional thinking. Yeah. So I think one way to address this on a very simple level is to challenge us to think about the language we're using and what's behind it. With respect to ethical misconduct and in research, I had a situation a number of years ago where a faculty member senior to me at my institution, working with a student, put out a flyer for research that broke every rule I ever heard of. It was the worst, it was shocking. I brought it to the faculty member, as my ethical code would say, direct corrective action, and was poo-pooed. So I elevated it right up to the RRB who had a fit. But there's also the interaction and the ethical codes that we all follow that I think also can either be a help or a hindrance in terms of managing misconduct. I'm wondering if you can comment.
I need a little more specificity between you spoke directly. I mean, from a clinical psychology standpoint, this is actually in the APA guidelines, ethical guidelines, of first you speak directly if that's feasible. Although that's a bit of a risk if it's a senior person and you're a junior person. It's still the right thing. Tomorrow I'm going to be talking about altruism versus incentives, but that's a different talk. So what exactly?
So maybe it's this issue of of the rules, I don't know if I have, quite honestly, I'm not sure I can articulate what I'm struggling with very well here. But it's multi-layered. It's not just the immediate decision, right, but it's that larger context and ramifications that you were referencing earlier.
Right.
And I think it speaks to the complexity of even something as simple as a research flyer.
As a research flyer, as in problematic, breaking the rules.
A flyer to market research.
Yeah. Well, I would argue that that can be really, really important. So you had to overcome a social context where there was risk to you to do this. And then you went to the IRB. There still could have been bad will between you and the senior person. You had to trust the IRB to actually take action. The IRB had to be able to take action, so it had to be empowered by the higher administration, because IRBs can be very limited in what they are able to do. Higher administration had to make the decision that this is a problem, put a stop to it. Higher administration might have been swayed in some circumstances if this was a high-powered researcher who brought gazillions of dollars in research funding and maybe would leave, or maybe drawing attention was going to shut down the research operation because federal investigators would, I mean, you can see the spiral. So this is all the incentives. Now, if you're doing your ethical analysis thoroughly, you might be thinking of all of these competing considerations. So occasionally doing a really thorough ethical analysis will not lead you to the simple, desirable course of action. It's complicated, right? And what you need to do then is not only be training the individuals. My personal frustration with our entire cultural context in the United States and Western countries is we put personal responsibility on people for things that are really contextual issues. And assuming people can stand against all the contextual issues, they're using up all their energy doing that. Where if you just tweaked what's going on at the sociocultural context level a little bit, I'm thinking about controlling food and sugary drinks and all of these things that, how much resistance do we expect people to engage in at all times? That was a very roundabout answer, but yeah, one thing at a time.
Join me in thanking Carol for a great talk.
Thank you. And it's okay. And if you're interested in going to Iceland, let me know. I've got flyers.